Today, on The Athlete's Mindset, I'm joined by Mark Jones, the mental health and sports performance consultant for Creighton Athletics. Mark plays a crucial role in supporting the mental well being and performance of athletes at the collegiate level. In this conversation, we dive into Mark's journey, how he found his calling in the mental performance world, and why he is so passionate about uplifting athletes both on and off the field. We'll talk about how he builds trust with players, the mindset challenges he sees most often, and the importance of separating your identity from your sport. Whether you're an athlete, coach, or someone who cares about mental health in sports, this episode is full of powerful insight and practical takeaways. Let's get into it. Mark, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Tristan. Good to see you. We have a long history here together, but unbeknownst to you, you don't know me very well. But
Yeah,
I've lived vicariously through you 3 years through your parents. So I'm glad to be
yeah,
here.
yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you could come on and just talk about all that you know. So, just to start, if you could walk us through just your journey and how you got into the mental performance world and just what kind of drives you.
Yep. Yeah. So I started my career a long time ago at Boys Town, which is where I met your parents. They worked for me for a short time there, and um, I was doing my master's degree, and I got me very interested in the sports performance part of just through some of the reading I've done. But that was really in the early 80s. And there wasn't a lot out there at that time. It wasn't very formalized. And the people who were doing it were, highly specialized and somewhat reclusive. You couldn't really reach them. The internet wasn't possible. There weren't a lot of journal articles, so on and so forth. And there were not a lot of college graduate programs at all. Matter of fact, I think there was one at San Diego State. Um, and that just wasn't very practical to get into it. But so I always did a lot of reading in the area, kind of finding whatever I could with the idea that this would be something I wanted to do. And it went on the shelf for, quite some time. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to be able to coach my kids and coach some at Boys Town, the basketball program. And then in the early 2000s, Creighton had a sports performance psychiatrist who unfortunately tragically passed away unexpectedly. And so I reached out to my contacts at Creighton, having been a former student athlete there, and just said, hey, should you need somebody to, support student athlete mental health? And I think this was 2002, maybe 2003, a long time ago. I'd be glad to help you. And they really didn't have any place else to look. And so I started seeing some of their students in the early 2000s, student athletes, for what was then more, strictly kind of mental health things with somebody adjusting to college, maybe some depression, anxiety, all the kind of things, homesickness, so on and so forth. And they were wise enough at that point to also realize, and you've been through this as an athlete, I have, that when their student athletes got injured, it was time that they needed to see somebody. They'd notice a drop off in their school performance and boredom and their social aspects and all those kind of things. Because as athletes, we all hate to be sidelined, right? And it kind of takes away our joy. And so really some wisdom from folks from Creighton. So it was on a real informal basis, strictly volunteer work. And then in the middle 2000s, I met Dr. Todd Stahl, and Dr. Stahl was the director of sports performance at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's a psychiatrist. He also works with the U.S. Olympic team. And so he was really a subject matter expert in this area. And I really consider myself lucky to be mentored by him and being able to take my background in psychology, youth, adult, and family services and all those kind of things, and then really become more um, strategic about helping the athletic department at Creighton for not only the mental health side, which of course always remains prominent. Student athlete mental health is one of the major emphases of the NCAA, right? It's one of their top goals, student athlete mental health. And then kind of blending that with some performance modules and talking to our coaches in the athletic department about like how I may be able to support them. At that same time, every university really began to grow There are sports performance, sports psychology programs. Every pro team began to do this in the early, 2010 and plus. And now there isn't a major college, and even some of the mid majors and some of the smaller colleges, plus all the professional teams, have at least one, if not multiple people on staff. Your brother, having played Nebraska, knows. I think they had a staff. They have a staff of 6. So they're very dedicated to the cause of student athlete mental health. And so I've been able to kind of be available, working with all sports at Creighton, and then doing some private practice as well. A small private practice kind of complements my full-time job. And so I've been doing that for years and always enjoyed working with athletes, whether it's, high school, college, or professional. And so that's kind of how I arrived at this, and it helps me keep competitive, kind of keep in the, keep in the game. Mostly in the last year or so, Creighton has even expanded and hired a full-time person in the counseling center, Dr. Julie Spencer, who's fantastic. And so the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, lose track of time, mostly been supporting men's basketball and the track and field and cross country programs. A little dabble in some of the other sports from time to time, but those are kind of my two specialty areas, if you will. But I really consider myself pretty facile in most sports, having pretty good competitive experience to kind of all the major sports in some one way or another. So that's the backstory.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like you said, it wasn't a huge kind of industry. There wasn't really a thing.
Right,
People just had athletes. Athletes would be struggling, and it was just like you figure it out.
right,
Be tough, be tough. And I think it's definitely gotten to a point nowadays where there's a lot going on. You have social media, you have a social life, you have classes, and it's just so hard to balance it all. And I mean, like this podcast is just so many people don't have an opportunity to kind of talk about the mental side or what's going on in their head.
right.
And so just having an avenue or someone to talk to can help tremendously. Was there a defining moment you think that you really wanted to get into this industry and just help athletes?
Um, I don't know that there was a defining moment, but I think there became a time, maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, where I began to have more influence over and kind of cut a wider swath and a wider path, so to speak, where people began to reach out to me more often. You kind of word of mouth kind of thing, and one thing I'm always real honest about is what sports performance can do and what it can't do. I mean, so, sometimes folks can get in there and think, well, if I could just get that, if I could get that just that 1 or 2% more, performance from my mental side, that, I'm going to be throwing 95 miles an hour. I'm going to run a 358 mile. And so I'm always, kind of cautious about, like, look, here's what I can do. Here's what we can do together is a better way to say that. Um, and it certainly can enhance your performance if you are so motivated and disciplined to apply some of the things we're going to talk about. But it's not going to take you, from a Division 3 sprinter to the Olympics, kind of thing, right? Because we all have our natural genetics bounds, and so it's a support system, And so I began to realize, like, look, this isn't necessarily going to change the world, but it's going to help you kind of incrementally grow as an athlete, and hopefully help you incrementally grow as a person.
Yeah, I it's funny you say that you shouldn't expect it to just, solve all your problems. I'm gonna be able to hit
Yes.
way better now because I do this. Because when, my freshman year at Fullerton, I started journaling a little bit, heard a little bit about that through,
Right.
Brian Kane. So I started journaling, and then we'd have a scrimmage, and I'd go 0 for 3, and I was like, "Why isn't this journaling helping? Why am I not hitting
Yeah.
better?" And I was just doing it all for the wrong reasons, and now I journal, and it's, just to, you know, ta you know, take away what's gone out through my day and, look for some positives and look what's
Right.
going well. But back then I was just expecting it to just flip a switch. And
Yes.
I mean, that's just not how it works.
It's not how it works. And what I also focus on is, like, let's take a baseball player. It's a great example, and it's the difference between giving people, um, athletes have a perception, like, I'm in a slump, and then sometimes what they lose is perspective. And what I mean by that is, if you and I were working together and you were at Fullerton or Portland, um, and we defined an area that we were going to work on, I might say to you, Tristan, are you a better player now than when you were a sophomore in high school? And you'd inevitably say yes. And the next thing, I'd say, okay, are you a better player now than when you were a senior in high school? And inevitably you say yes. And I say, okay, let's say you are Portland your junior year. I know you had a good year there. Um, are you a better player now when you were a freshman in college? And inevitably you'd say yes. And so I'd say, now you're a junior in college. Are you a better player now? And inevitably you'd say yes. And so the point of all that is you're really focusing on like improvement over time, right? And as athletes, if we can all focus on improvement over time, then that's where the game is won, right? We're not all going to play in the major leagues, the NBA, or run in the Olympics, but if we can focus on improvement over time, then we've had a great journey and we've had a great situation. We've probably built some really good relationships along the
Hmm.
way and had a really positive experience. Whereas performance varies, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so you know, you might be that 355 miler, but there's some days when you're going to run 401. But that doesn't mean, you're not capable of running a 355 mile again. And you might go, over a weekend, you might go 9 for 15, um, at the plate in a 3 game or 4 game series. But that doesn't mean, you're a worse player next week when you go 2 for 11. And so what you focus on with athletes, and it makes sense to them, that's the difference between perspective, I'm getting better over time, versus perception of, oh, I suck today, right? Kind of thing. I'm not doing well. And you get them to focus on improvement over time, and it usually kind of relaxes them and like, oh, I get it. I'm a heck of a lot better now than I was even in the fall.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember at Fullerton, I was kind of struggling in the fall of my freshman year, and I remember calling my mom and I was just telling her, how I'm terrible, like I haven't had any success, and she was like, literally last weekend, like you had 2 hits in one of your scrimmages, and I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, that doesn't count though, and I'm just like, the perspective just wasn't there of like, all right, not
Yes.
every day is going to be perfect, but like you said, I am way better now than I
Right.
was even just a few months ago.
Right. Yeah, and so kind of helping folks through that. And the point of that is, how I approach this is one of your questions is I don't have a kind of a rigid model that I apply, right, and use. What I think I do well is I'm very pragmatic, and um, a lot of people, and let me give you an example of that. A lot of people think like, okay, I just got to think positive. I got to have positive self-talk, and I have to have all these positive thoughts, and I have to have confidence and all those kind of things. It's like the issue is, okay, how's that working for you? Because if that absolutely just worked, like you could just create this positive narrative in your head, guess what? You and I would never be talking, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so my approach is to really focus on what's working for someone, right? And then to get them to agree, like, okay, that's not necessarily working, right? And so now let's find some models, let's find some little behaviors, and a lot of times it just comes down to helping athletes breathe, um, and the breathing becomes so very important. And one of the things I'm insistent on is just the value of breathing and practice breathing. I have like, look, I want you to practice breathing before you go to bed at night, and I'm going to give you a breathing routine. And I want you to do that when you get up in the morning. And guess what? You can do that at a dead ball in front of 17,000 people. I can help you run through your breathing routine. You can run
Yeah.
through your breathing routine. And because this as a baseball player, particularly as an infielder, and a relaxed muscle performs a lot better than a tense muscle. And that's where that breathing comes in. So important, even at the plate, right? um, you overswinging, overstriding, that's all from being way too tense. Yeah.
Yeah, I always would. One thing I started last year at Portland is whenever like times were getting tough or I was kind of struggling or maybe had two not great at bats, my first at bats, I would just be like, when's the last time I took a deep breath? Like I would just ask myself that
Yeah.
because it was probably way too
Good for
long
you.
ago. And so I was like, all right, when's the last time you took a deep breath? And I'd take a deep breath and be like, all right, like we're present, can't do anything about that, but like relax. Like if
Right.
I keep living way back in those last two at bats, how am I
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
expect to have success in my third at bat?
Yep.
And I think that's something that a lot of athletes take a long time to kind of learn. And it took me till my senior year of college. So
Yeah. I mean, and it's a lifelong struggle, no matter what walk of life you're in, right? The ability to just kind of breathe and be in the present moment. And one thing I try and work with my athletes on is, look, when you're caught up in the last play and the next play, you are actually sacrificing your competitiveness, because your competitiveness lies is embedded in this play. And if you're in the last play, you have taken an edge off your competitiveness. And if you're in, looking over your shoulder, and basketball is a great game for that. If you make a mistake, somebody's looking over your shoulder, right? That whole kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And so, one of my models is to really stay like, staying in the moment helps you be that super ultra competitive athlete that you want to be. And so don't sacrifice that by last play and next play. And that's easier than it sounds, because now you have to have people you have to help athletes kind of untangle all that negative narrative in their head, and not just avoid it, and not just switch it to, think more positive, but actually just teaching them how to acknowledge it,
Mhm.
see it for what it is, and move on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the secret sauce in terms of how I move with my athletes. It's a little bit of an abstraction, but once they get that down, they're like, that makes so much more sense, because I was always just thought that I had to avoid a negative thought, or I had
Yeah.
to think just more positive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Kind of going along with that, what are some kind of common struggles or common things you see a lot of athletes, collegiate athletes struggle with nowadays that,
yeah, yeah.
pretty much everyone could work on?
Yeah, so I'll start kind of at the bottom of the pyramid. I think the first thing, I don't know how much this has come up on your previous podcast with the elite athletes you work for. I know you had Bryce Matthews on there. You know what a player he was, and
Yeah.
some guys in pitching in the majors right now, and so on and so forth. But first thing I always start with is, how are you sleeping, right? There was a really important study that's been replicated several times, is that um, only 26% of student athletes get the acquired amount of sleep, which is 8 to 9 hours of sleep per
Wow.
night,
Yeah.
recommended between 18 and 22-year-olds. And then that festers into this next thing that you brought up earlier, which is the whole social media thing, and kids being on their phone late at night, and the blue light, how it keeps you up at night and doesn't allow for kind of the ambient light disrupts your sleep, and all those kind of things. Plus the need to, somebody texted me, now I got to respond, right? Or there's a tweet, or there's a TikTok, I have to see it, right? And now you add that in with the pressure of classes, and all the things that go with that. And then, elite athletes, elite colleges, you have all this attention for their time. It's boosters, it's NIL, all those kind of things. And so, um, those are the common struggles. Is they never feel like necessarily they just get the time to be a kid, B, just a student athlete, or C, even have just downtime. And
Yeah.
so, helping them just find some downtime where they get to shut their brain off, like your computer's in default mode, is really super important, right? That downtime, that brain recovery time, is just as important as that body recovery time. And my point on that is, as you go to what the struggles are here, Tristan, is if they don't get that time, that's when you see those mental health problems kind of begin to creep in, where, you know, if you're not sleeping well, you're probably a little crabby, you're a little bit irritated, you could be a little short with people, right? You probably worry more about things, you
Yeah.
probably overinterpret things, all those kind of things. So we start with sleep. We move into breathing, right? And then we talk about how comfortable they are in their social aspect. How's things with the families? We know we have a lot of families who are kind of helicopter parents right now, and they want to call the coaches and do all those kind of things. So you kind of have to help them de-stress their world a little bit and see what they can take control of, and kind of work through, and what they can kind of let go. Because that kind of stress, unchecked and unregulated, can lead to some real serious mental health problems. And we've all kind of heard the horror stories of kids that, at all colleges, whether it's junior college or division, 1, 2, or 3, or NIA, just feel like they're overloaded so much that
Yeah.
that it it creates a dangerous place in their life one way or the other.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, I mean, like you kind of talked about, is how so many athletes are balancing all these things. It makes it
Yes,
hard to realize that you're playing a game. Like the sport
right.
you're playing is just a game. And even me, it took me until after I was done playing to realize like I did not need to put that much pressure on myself. I didn't need to take everything so seriously. Not
Yep.
every error at bat was, life or death. And I think when you're, struggling in your own sport and also just in your outside life, it makes it so hard to just find those little things that, do make you happy or stay positive.
Right. Yeah, and as a young athlete, the other thing to remind is like, our brains aren't even fully developed until we're 26 or 27. So that part of our brain that affects judgment and reasoning and decision making is not fully developed. And so we have to give young athletes kind of a sense of grace where we don't expect them to be perfect and flawless and everything and make great decisions. That's all part of the growth process, and helping young people work through that, giving them perspective, giving them skills and options, and helping them problem solve through those kind of things, because that helps develop their problem solving, their judgment, and their decision making over time. So you're working with them versus telling them. Um, and coaches get to tell folks like me it's working with, right? And the best coaches, as you know, work with teams and work with players versus work at them.
Yeah. Kind of staying just with coaching. How do you think coaches can make, maybe a better impact on their players, or kind of just make sure that their players are doing okay outside of their sport or even just in their sport? Because, I mean, when I was at Fullerton my sophomore year, um, there'd be weeks or just quite a few days where I wouldn't really even have a conversation with a coach, like not just like a
Right.
how are you? And that just made it so hard because I felt like I was just, struggling all by myself and just had to figure out everything by myself. And there were a few days where I was just like, I don't even know what I'm doing. Like
Right.
just so in my own head without, even having anyone I felt like could just be there for me, I guess.
Yeah, so that's really a great question, and I can answer that several ways. There's kind of that old school approach, right? And where kind of things are all business, and what I think the coaches who are able to make that transition to realizing they're really in many ways a caregiver for kids in their program, whether you're in the high school program or you're in a college program, and in some regards, even in a professional program, even though the stakes are really higher. And so I'll explain it this way. And I do work with coaches, and I kind of explain it this way, like, okay, there is a transact, you can see coaching as a transaction, meaning you go put your debit card in the US bank teller window and get 50 bucks out. That's a transaction. Or there's a transformational approach when um, the coach says, all right, put your card in there and get your money out, but I'm going to kind of help you think about how to spend that money. And what would be the best way to spend that money? Is it really a good time to take that money out? Think of what you have to pay for next week, all those kind of things. And I think the key is getting coaches to see, like, look, um, your job is to be transformational for no matter what level, whether you're working with high school or junior high kids, right? To help them be transformative into their best potential, not just a transaction, wins, losses, outs, batting percentages. It's easy to fall into that trap as a coach. So I'm not criticizing the coaches. It's easy to fall into that trap and miss the human part of that. And I think there's a couple of ways to do that every day. Coach McDermott does such a great job of this. So every day before practice, when they huddle up, there is some sort of personal touch every single day, in which there's kind of a thought for the day, there's a theme for the day, there's a check-in on, classes, all those kind of things, that makes it, that builds trust.
Yeah.
And then that kind of carries throughout the program when you realize, like, look, I'm not just talking about winning and losing games, whether it's lacrosse or winning track meets or winning baseball games. I'm here for that purpose. And so now you develop a relationship. the downstream benefit of that is when you've built that trust and you've built that relationship, you've also put that young man or woman into a better psychological space to perform better because now their brain is not reacting to fear, it's reacting to opportunity. And so, even though, sports tend to be urgent, they're time based, everything has to happen in a really short period of time. But if you can kind of see, like, look, I'm actually going to affect their judgment and their decision making and their problem solving in competition better if I can reach them in a way that isn't fear based. I get better outcomes as a coach, and guess what? We're all happier as a
Yeah.
collective unit. So that's the thing. I think that I could go on to a cool long technical dissertation about what's called working memory, which is how many ideas we can hold in our head at one time. Which in complex sports, you have to you have to have multiple things in your head at one time. And if you put too much stress on the athlete in terms of the kind of things you were just talking about, Tristan, their ability to handle multiple things at one time goes down. And guess what? Their performance goes down as well.
Yeah.
So, the relationship part isn't just about being, squishy and soft and all those kind of things. It's the right thing to do, but it also gets better outcomes for everybody.
Mhm. Yeah. I think there's sometimes coaches will use the excuse like, oh, I'm yelling at you because I expect more out of you, or I'm yelling at you for
Yep.
this, but they haven't done the work behind the scenes or at practice to
Yep.
build that relationship. Because
Yep.
if I have a coach that, is, positive with me or asking how I'm doing and teaching me, and then there's one time where maybe I mess up or don't do what I was supposed to do and he gets on me, I'm like, I understand that. You've
Yep.
put all this work into me to be successful. I got to be better. But when a coach is just yelling constantly and not giving like that trust, building that trust, it makes
Yep.
it so hard for an athlete to perform confidently and freely and not just like, oh, I hope I don't get blown up today again. What's up, everyone? It's Tristan. Whether I'm recording a podcast, training, or just trying to stay sharp throughout the day, hydration matters. That's why I partnered with Relight by Redmond. My two go-tos are mixed berry and lemon lime. And they have great ingredients, taste great, no problems at all, and just keeps me fresh throughout the entire day. Relight has helped me stay focused, energized, and ready to go, whether I'm hitting the gym, deep into an episode, or just living day-to-day life. They also have a great pre-workout, blueberry lemonade or peach mango, that gets you ready if you need a little extra kick before you hit the gym. And if you want to try Relight for yourself, use the discount code AthletesMindset for 15% off. I'll drop the link in the bio and in the description, and you can get a good taste of what Relight's all about.
You got it. No, I mean, you have a great perspective on that in terms of just the importance of that and, what you can take away from that and how it affects your performance. So, that's a really wise way of looking at your role. And I'm sure in your coaching, and I think your first or second year at Millard North now,
First year.
first year, I'm sure you're finding that too, that when you can make that connection, that you just get better outcomes, you feel better about yourself and you feel better about the kid.
Yeah. And one thing, so Darren Erstad came and talked to us at Portland last year, and he just said, biggest takeaway is when you guys are done playing is remember how hard the game is.
Yep.
I think a lot of coaches will start coaching and they'll watch guys and they'll be like, oh, if I was in that situation, I would have hit a home run, or like I wouldn't have
Right.
missed that shot. I wouldn't have turned the ball over here.
Yep.
And I think just looking back and being like, I made plenty of mistakes throughout my career. The game is hard. Like these guys are going to fail. It's just
Yep.
how am I going to respond and, make it a learning opportunity instead of just, putting fear into them.
Right. Yep. Well said. Well
So,
said.
yeah. What are some of your models that you use, especially, let's say in game, you have
Yep.
a turnover or a guy misses a few shots in a row. What are some kind of models or just things you teach guys to just,
Yeah.
kind of flip that switch and not just continue on a downhill spiral?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of models. We already talked about the breathing. That's really important. We talked about kind of the acknowledgement and letting thoughts pass. You know, the, not time to break that down necessarily on a podcast like today, but a couple of the things that I usually have is um, a a little intervention I call focus, right? And focus is a way of thinking about. um, where am I going to turn my attention to? And let me give you an example. At Creighton, a couple years ago, we had a point guard who kind of leaned into a little bit to the anxious side of things, just naturally wired. I mean, we're all wired, in different ways. And he just kind of leaned into, kind of some biologically a little bit anxious. And so we came up with a metaphor, if you, so to speak, of the using the shot clock, because everybody can see the shot clock. With baseball players, I've used the foul pole, because you can always see the foul pole, where you're at, right? Um, um, and what it was, the basketball player, I think this is a really good example of this, and who's ever listening will relate to this. And so we came up with some key words that he needed to kind of focus on. And what he came up with was the word pick, which is obviously a basketball metaphor, but it stood for pace, include others, and under control. And so now every time he looked at the shot clock, he had, whether it was a dead ball or even when he was dribbling the ball down the court at, 1,000 miles an hour, he had that visual in his head. And then that visual then related to those key words he was going to have over and over, right? And so it just kind of kept those focus goals right in front of him at all times, right? And so you can kind of move that around, right? Like, with a baseball player, pitcher who, is maybe overstriding or something like that, just to be able to, like, a keyword like, look at the pitch clock and say, smooth stride or something like that, right? And it takes you out of worrying about all these extraneous things and just into a focus point. So that's one that I use a lot. And the other one is, I we use a baseball and basketball metaphor for this, but it fits in every sport. Although it's harder in the Olympic sports like rowing, swimming, and track and field. But so the other thing is that I take them through an exercise. If you strike out, what's that mean? Or if you miss a shot, what's that mean? And they're like, well, I missed a shot, so this means, like, I might be thinking about, like, what's going to happen the next one, or I might be thinking about, does my teammates trust me? Like, no, you missed a shot, which means you missed a shot, which means you missed a shot, or you struck out, which means you struck out, which means you struck out. So missing a shot is a physics problem, as well as striking out is simply a physics problem, right? It's energy and the force and velocity and all those kind of things. And so the game itself, even baseball, you play an infield, and you dub one or you overrun a foul ball or fly ball. It's just a physics problem. Everything else, the athlete adds in himself, right? The misery of, like, now coach is pissed and, my teammates don't trust me or I might get taken out, right? So those are the kind of things that we add in, that then create a story and a narrative that really keeps us stuck where we're at, right? Versus,
Yeah.
missing a shot is simply a physics problem, as well as throwing a ball, or, missing a curveball. And so just getting them to focus on, I missed a shot, which means I missed a shot, which means I missed a shot. Um, and now you're not adding meaning to it, right? And because it's not the thought itself, it's the meaning that really screws you up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm just thinking about how when I was um, at Fullerton, especially, is I would have a bad day, maybe a bad scrimmage or BP or something, and I would go back to my dorm room and just think, like, oh gosh, like the coaches are probably thinking that I'm terrible. They're
Yes.
thinking this, like, or my teammates probably think I'm awful, like, and none of it was true. And I always bring it up with the guys at Miller North is so many games I would never have any idea what my teammates did. Like if they had to like hit 2 home runs or something, obviously I remember that. But if they
Yep.
came up to me after the game and say, "Hey, like, how did I do today?" I'd be like, "Oh, did you go like 1 for 4, 2 for 4?" Because everyone's so worried about themselves that
Yep.
people don't have time to really like think about what everyone else is doing. And so if you just put in perspective, like, all right, I have my day, and if I can just be the best I can, if I do fail, people aren't overthinking about it. Like
Right.
people aren't thinking about it that much. And I think that was one of my biggest problems is I would go into the next day thinking like, well, I don't want this to happen. I don't want the coaches to think I'm awful
Yeah.
or my teammates to think I'm awful when that just wasn't even the case in the first place.
Right. Yep. Now, you mean you did a lot of your own you kind of figure things out on your own, which is another part of, I think, the sports psychology part that's really, really important that I try to model is like, look, I don't need to be the person who solves every problem and is in every intervention and has all these motivational talks that can be, can kind of give the industry a bit of a bad name, because none of really this is about motivation and anything like that. Because at the end of the day, you want athletes to figure it out for themselves. You want to be available. You want to be able to support them however you can. But you don't want to be in every kind of thing. And so when I work with athletes, it's usually like really short. When I do when I do team stuff, whoever it's with, I maybe make it 5 to 7 minutes at the most, right? I'll show a clip. We'll talk about the clip, how the clip relates to some mental performance skill. Then I'll follow up with them, right? But at the end of the day, you want kids to be able to no matter what the level, to be resilient and figure things out on your own. And you just gave me some great examples where, in reflection, you're like, wait, I'm making myself miserable here for things that necessarily aren't even true. I'm making up a story that doesn't even
Yeah.
exist,
Hmm.
in reality. But what did exist was a physics problem.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, that was one thing I like finally learned just later in my career is all right, like what's real? What really happened?
Yes.
I struck out. All right, yes, I was a little late. Like you said, it's a physics problem. I was a little late on that fastball. I just got to be a little earlier. It doesn't
Yep.
mean everyone in the dugout hates me. It doesn't mean
Right.
anything. All that happened
Yep.
was, all right, next at bat, just, make this slight adjustment and we're good. And I think
Yes.
once you athletes realize not to take things so deeply or, try to divvy up and think about every little thing that happened and just say what really happened and what's real. It makes it so
Right.
much easier just to respond at the next opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that goes back to something we talked earlier about, like, now you're truly being competitive, right?
Hmm.
Versus all these other things. Because when you play that game, and it's natural as human beings, we all add in, because we're social beings, we all add in, like, how is everyone else seeing me? Do I fit in?
Yeah.
Am I, the fear of missing out, all those kind of things. It's natural, whether you're an athlete or non-athlete, you're a singer, performer, and in the insurance industry, or the transportation industry, like your mom was, right? That those are all natural kind of things, but then you realize that it's a dangerous game that we play with ourselves, and we bring in a lot of misery. And athletes can bring themselves to a lot of misery by overplaying that game, and kind of helping them deconstruct that. Like you mentioned, like, okay, wait a second here. So I struck out, and nobody hates me.
Yeah,
Probably just the opposite, right? Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I loved was on a recent episode with Colby Halter, who went to Florida, he brought up just how he, um, like just talk to himself and how he always just kind of was always negative. Like he would strike out and he would be, saying the worst things to himself. But let's say a teammate strikes out, you don't think they're terrible. Like I would never see a guy strike out and be like, oh my God, he's terrible. I would never say the things I say to
Right.
myself to him because I also don't
Right.
believe them. Like I
Yeah.
trust the next at bat, my teammate's going to go and, get a hit, be successful. But I didn't think that for myself. And so I think that was just a huge part that, made me take a little bit of a jump of what if I just talk to everyone else or see myself in a third person point of view?
Right.
Like if I fail, flush it, whatever, it happens.
Yep.
And I think a lot of times people don't fear failure. I think they fear judgment. And
Hmm.
so once you realize, all right, it was the same thing with just starting the podcast is, did I fear failure? Like, did I fear like no one would listen or this wouldn't work? Or did I fear like, what will other people say if this doesn't work? And I was like,
Yeah.
if I'm worried about what other people think, then let's just do it.
Right. Yep. No, you're a wise young man, and you're kind of nailing really the central tenets of sports psychology. But we all learn those things over time through
Yeah.
trial and error. But you figured it
Mhm.
out for yourself, which is why you
Mhm.
want athletes to be able to do. But you don't want them to have to feel like they're being alone,
Yeah.
if indeed they do need some of those supports. And I think that's been one of the benefits, where as a society, particularly young people of your generation, are more comfortable talking about mental health,
Mhm.
now more likely to seek out a therapist, to seek out counseling. to seek out psychiatric care if necessary. And for probably for way too long, we ignored this aspect for people both at the professional college and high school level that if help is needed, then help is there. And so it's been really gratifying to see the industry of sports performance and mental health support kind of grow over the years, and the recognition by all the major sports leagues. You go look at folks like uh, Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan, who've been out there and done commercials, and look at Simone Biles a few years ago in the 2016 Olympics, right? Or 2020
Yeah.
Olympics. She got the bends and just like, I can't do this anymore, right? And but she was very open about that. And that's when those are situations where the supports are needed. Um, and I think athletes, we're, mostly focused on the college level, but we're focused, back to the high school level too, is like the one advantage they have, tons of kids that you went to college with at Fullerton or Portland, they'd go through the whole day or maybe a whole week and never talk to an adult, right? They're young people in 18, 19, 20, never talk to an adult. If college athletics is done right, at least you're seeing you're in front of an adult every day who's looking at you saying like, man, you look tired, you look stressed, or, all those kind of things, right? There's a huge advantage to that in terms of having somebody else be able to kind of look at you.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and look after you and build that connection.
Mhm. 100%.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to athletes who are possibly hesitant about opening up and seeking help if they need it?
Yeah. Wow. What a really, really good question. So the thing is like the advice I give is actually a simple one is like reaching out for help is not a weakness. It's actually a sign of strength. And we've been able to flip that narrative to a certain degree, but we just need to continue on that theme. And reaching out for help is an absolute sign of strength. And so, and it takes a little bit of initiative, a little bit of courage to kind of lean into that, but it's absolutely the best thing they can do is not see it as a sign of weakness because let's face it, athletics, why it is just a game, um, is about toughness at some, most of it's all about toughness, kind of thing, right? And so we're kind of taught, particularly as male athletes, that, you know, you have to be tough all the time. And if you're not tough all the time, then something's wrong with you. When in fact, probably the opposite is true. That if you show your humanity, and you reach out and you get help when you need it, that there's help there. And fortunately, there's the I can't cite statistics, but the increase in resources over the last 10 or 15 years is just exponential growth in terms of what's available for athletes.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think? What do you wish more people understood about the mental side of sports? I feel like a lot of people on the outside, fans especially in professional sports, sometimes forget that these people are human. Like these
Yeah.
athletes out here are human. What do you wish people understood a little bit more?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. The first one is I don't think people appreciate all the time that goes into it, the demands on the athletes in terms of just their, whether, at any level, right? Just the amount of time that goes into whether you're playing travel baseball or, 7-on-7 football camps, all those kind of things. So it takes a tremendous amount of dedication. I don't think that the average person necessarily understands that what goes into it, the weightlifting, the rehab, the conditioning, plus the on the field time, extra batting practice, all those kind of things. And I think the other thing that is maybe lost on the public is how much athletes really care about their performance. And that, yes, it is just a game. Um, but by and large, most athletes really, really do care about their performance. And so giving them the gratitude and the space to be able to say, you're working really hard and doing your best. And we appreciate, all the time and effort and expertise you're putting into this. I think that can kind of get lost. Um, just what a challenge it is to be, a college or professional, even high school athletes in these days. I mean, think these club volleyball programs, man, it's just like, I mean, it's a grinder, right? And that goes
Yeah.
back to something we talked about earlier. Even in that grinder, it's important to help find people find downtime. The young athletes find downtime and get that amount of rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always thought about it as, fans are so quick to, talk negatively about athletes after they fail or when they struggle. I'm just like, imagine you were at your 9 to 5 and anytime you failed, you had everyone on social media just bashing on you. You had all these
Yes,
people just around you just yelling at you. Like, that's no way to live. Like, these guys are, professional athletes, especially, it's their job. Like, they take
right,
it extremely seriously and there's so much time and effort, like you said, put into it, and fans just are so quick to say negative things about them or anything like that. It's just, I think it just takes away the humanity part of it, that these
yeah,
these are just humans that are exceptional at what they do. They're just
right.
unbelievably athletic. They're unreal athletes, and people just don't think about that enough, I don't think.
Yeah, nobody's standing over a surgeon like, "Hey, I think you went a little too higher on that vein, right? Like you
Yeah.
went a little too high on that, or your scalpel was a little bit, that incision was a little bit too long." But yet, we'll, you know, we'll criticize the hell out of some pitcher through 355 feet. You know,
Yeah, exactly. Especially with collegiate athletes, is they're, 18 to 22 and, these, old men are just on their heads all the time.
right?
And it's just like
Yes,
you never threw 95. You never even threw
right.
close to that. Like you have no clue what
Yeah.
this guy has done to get where he is and what he's going through right now when he is struggling. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I want to end every conversation with the same question. If you could go back and tell yourself younger self one thing, give yourself a piece of advice just about the mental side of sports and just growth, what would it be?
That's such a great question, and I'll answer it a couple of different ways, but I'll be 65 this summer. Um, and it's funny now that life begins to slow down just a little bit, you reflect a lot more on kind of the lessons learned. And I find myself a lot more than, even in the past 5 to 10 years, kind of saying, I wish I would have. Um, and, going and wishing I had the opportunity to go back and recreate this, kind of recreate this. And why I put the work in, the time in, I'm not sure I was disciplined enough, as disciplined as I should have been. I'm sure back at the time I thought I was working really hard, but I'm not sure I necessarily did all the right things. Um, and I think also what, you know, that's kind of on the performance side, but I think kind of more on the aspect you and I are talking about. I don't think I was probably as ready. Um, to take hard coaching like maybe I should have, right? And so, we've talked about kind of the softer side of this, but there's nothing wrong with hard coaching if those relationship variables are there. And I probably, looking back on it, could have done more to embrace hard coaching and worked on the results of that. And I got to admit, I'm almost 65 years old. It's been almost 45 years since I played a college basketball game, but I wake up every day thinking about basketball and thinking about like how things could have changed and been different, and what I could have done differently. And so I yeah, my my response to that is don't be motivated, be disciplined. And so, a lot of times we talk about confidence and discipline. I say, like, and one of my models is like, the model is be disciplined and pay attention to your experience. And so I wish I would have been less ego driven and more willing to take hard coaching, because hard coaching can get you to that next level. And I'm not saying I would have, made the next level or something, but it just would have improved my performance if I had been more open to hard coaching and a little less ego driven.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think motivation sticks around for just a little bit and then it can run out, but discipline is just
Yeah.
every day, just working towards something. And then after a month, after a year, you look back at that discipline and recognize how much better you got and how
Yeah.
much you've just learned and grown.
Yeah.
So,
I think we can end with this. It's your podcast, so you should get to determine when
oh
we
no,
end.
go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, it said, one of the things I've kind of run into lately, it says, the saying that I really love is like, you don't decide your future, you decide your habits, and your habits decide your future. And I think that's a really good message for all walks of life, but it's particularly a good way of looking at things for athletes.
Yes, definitely. I love that. Well,
Yeah.
Mark, thanks for coming on. This was awesome.
Yep.
Your insight is unbelievable. And I think so many people are going to have so many great takeaways from this.
Very good. And if I can, help anybody through who sees this and needs to make a connection, please feel free to pass on the information, my information and contact information. I'd love to be a resource for athletes at any level.
Yes, sir. Absolutely will do. Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Thank you again to Mark for sharing his journey and insight into the mental side of the game. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might find it valuable. Thanks for tuning in and keep moving forward. Until next time.